Hey LinkedIn, I hope everybody's having a good week. I wanted to come in and do a really quick thought leadership video around custom objects and creating like a count of property. So inside of your reporting, there's default values. So for example, if you're doing a single object report on contacts, one of the fields that you'll get to use is a count of contacts. And you can then put that on your x-axis, which then counts using the count of contacts. So when you create a custom object, if you were to do custom object reporting with the custom object report, you will get a count of, for example, in this we're using the win back tracking. So this is a custom object I've created in this portal, which allows us to track when a particular goal is met on a workflow. So in this example, I've stripped it down so that it actually took out the original logic that existed for the client, which was very specific to an outcome that we wanted to occur. So I just created a general example, which would be that we have a renewal process. And like, let's say this renewal process happens every month. So every month we have to reattempt to win back, a contact in our system. Um, and essentially what this thought leadership video is showing is how to build in a tracking mechanism that allows you to count or build in a count of property that allows you to report on things beyond what would be allowed just through the default out of the box reporting. So in this instance, we'll say that renewal, every time there's a renewal, the number of associated deals becomes known. And you could also add in some logic here. It could be a deal-based workflow where, they also have to reach closed one, for example. When that happens, that's going to trigger the creation of a new record for this custom object, which we've created called win back tracking. We then would call that whatever the name is. You can also add other properties, which we did for this model, but I've stripped that out again. So this is the actual part of the workflow that would show you how to build this. So if you have, in this example, contact who's going through a cyclical process, it's a process that repeats itself to try to win them back, over and over again over a course of time, and they're going to keep coming down this process repeatedly. That means that they can be won back more than one time. That's a very common business requirement. Um, so in this instance, you may want to get to a level of information in your reporting that allows you to see how many records or how many times a contact has been won back. That's not stored anywhere. That's not going to come out of the box. You actually have to build that in. So if I wanted to get a count of win backs so that I knew how many times one particular contact had been won back over time, I would be able to get there through this. So this is based on part one, a custom object workflow. So we have the win back tracking object, which would be created here. So every time a new record is created, it's going to populate, and then it's going to populate within record ID. So every single instance of a record being created for win back tracking will trigger this first workflow. That workflow is then going to pass. It's going to set a property value for all of the associated contacts, and it's going to the property is increase count of object by 1, and it's going to set that to yes. What that's done now is it's used the association between the custom object and the contact, and it's passed over a value into that contact, which then allows us to trigger a contact-based workflow. So if a contact's enrollment trigger of increase count of object by 1 is known, and then we have that on we have this set to re-enroll. So every single instance of the increased count of object by 1 is known, a contact will come back down the workflow. So it's a cyclical process. They continue to re-enroll every time that becomes known. What we then do is there's another property. This is increase count by 1, which was set in the previous workflow. And then we have a second property, which is actually a numeric value for count of, in this example, 365 or renewal win back objects. And we increase that by 1. So every time the contact comes back down this workflow, it's going to increase that value by 1. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to clear the increased count of object by 1, which is the trigger here, which resets the entire process, allowing re-enrollment. So what's going to happen is every time number of associated deals is known for a contact, they're going to come down this workflow. It's going to create win back tracking custom object. That's going to then trigger if record ID is known based on the win back custom object workflow, to then set the contact property increase count of object by 1 to yes for all associated contacts. Part 2 is then going to trigger based on this value that would be populated here. And it's also going to clear that value at the end so that if a contact comes back down, or if a custom object comes back down and then populates the contact another instance, it would allow them to re-enroll down this workflow, because this logic is known, works, but it only works if the value is different than it was the first time. So because we're only ever setting this value to yes, that value is not changing. And when that value is reset, it's not a new value, so it's not going to re-enroll the contact. That's why it's very important that we clear that object at the very end of this. The last piece of this was to set a grouping. So what happened was, once we did this reporting, we saw that there were people who had come down this process and had been won back over 50 times. So we actually hadn't ever gotten to that level of information, as how many times are we winning people back. So we've built this custom object. We've now built this count property that allows us to see how many times a particular contact has been won back. What happened was the report then became very busy, because there was like so many values included. So what we do there to make the report make this report more readable is to actually create a grouping version of that property. So if the count, again, this is a contact-based workflow, if the count of 365 win-back objects is known, and this will have re-enrollment as well, and that value is never going to be the same because it always increases by a count of 1. They're going to continue to come down this workflow. So I'm going to check, and yeah, this one should be 1 through 5. So that logic was wrong. Yeah, so it's going to check 1 through 5, 6 through 10, 11 through 20, 21 through 30, 31 through 40, 41 through 50, and then anything greater than 50. And then what that's going to do is it's going to set this property grouping. So the number of times contact was won back to, and either 1 through 5, 6 through 10, all the way up to 50 plus, which is then going to allow us to set the x-axis so that it's not count of every single time, but it groups those counts so that we can see the contacts a little bit more clearly, and it makes the reports more readable. This is one example. There's several use cases this could be used for. Another good example of that would be if you had like an event custom object that allowed you to track in-person events, and that would actually represent the event itself, right? And we want to see what is the number of attendees that, and we want to report on the number of attendees. There's several ways to get to that, but one way that you could get to that would be through this process, and then passing off objects between, or properties between the custom object and their associated records to create a count of property, and then you can actually report on it. So some pretty cool stuff, some pretty cool use cases that you can build this out for. And I just thought that I would share this in case anybody has a similar use case where this can be implemented. I hope you find this video valuable, and I appreciate everybody who watched it to the end. Thank you, and have a great rest of your week.